It's time for Cover 2 Broncos. Just a couple dudes breaking down scheme, film, and the numbers. Now, your hosts, Joe Rowles and Jeff Essery.
Thanks for listening to Cover 2 Broncos. I'm Jeff Essery.
And I'm Joe Rowles, and this is a special edition of Cover 2 Broncos with video and Mile High Report's own Joe Mahoney. We're hoping to kind of do a deep dive on Garett Bolles, and Joe has some expertise in this area. He's played on the offensive line in a way that neither Jeff or I have, and he also took the time to go back and look over Drew Lock's entire game sample and give us the pressures of the entire time and kind of assess who did what. So there's no one better to kind of bring on, and let's talk Garett Bolles.
Yeah, welcome, Joe. Thanks for jumping on with us. This is exciting.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. Everybody's excited about this, except for maybe my wife, who's kind of giving me the stink eye for taking up some of our TV watching time this evening. But I think I got a whole pass for this one.
Well, we appreciate it, and so we're the beneficiaries of all the additional time. So thanks for coming on. And like Joe mentioned, we're going to try something new. We thought this would be a great opportunity since we're talking about, Garett Bolles. He's been kind of a hot topic since the draft, and also since the fifth-year option stuff has come up with Denver not picking up his fifth-year option. So we thought what better way to talk about it, not only just via podcast, but also add some video elements to it and hopefully be able to pull up some of the clips that we have from Garett Bolles' tape and walk through them in real time and really set out to answer this question I think that everybody's asking, and some people have, put out there as more of a statement is, did Garett Bolles improve in 2019? I think when you look across, Pro Football Focus grades and people citing either penalty stats or sack stats, some people would put the stake in the ground and say, yeah, he did improve. The collective three of us together went back to the tape to really look at, was that reality from what the tape shows? And so that's kind of where we're going to start today and dig in from there.
So, yeah, and just to call back to the article that I dropped last week with the, all 186 dropbacks that Drew Lock had and every single pressure or time he was pressured, Bolles was only, at fault in 7 of those. So from a snaps per pressure perspective, he was pretty good. I mean, only McGovern and Leary were better than he was, and Leary only played 47 snaps. So, Bolles was better than Risner, or Reisner, I always mispronounce his name, who really hit the wall in the last few games, the rookie wall. And, relative to Schlotman and Rodgers and Wilkinson, he was actually significantly better in those final 5 games. That being said, and we'll get into this, Joe pointed out when we were having the internal chat that a lot of that was just a function of him getting lucky and not having his faults really get exposed in those final 5 games. Because if you look at the pressure stats, those teams that we played, really only one of them was good at pressuring the passer. The other 4 opponents that Drew Lock faced were, pretty mediocre or bad at rushing the passer. Really only the Chiefs were decent at rushing the passer. The Chargers were, middle of the pack to the lower middle of the pack. And then the other 3 opponents were terrible, near the bottom of the league. Raiders and Texans and, who am I missing? I forget. Texans and who am I missing? I forget. I pulled them up the other day. Lions. That's right. Lions, Raiders, and Texans were all in the bottom 5 in terms of.
And this is probably a good time to talk about. And Joe, I'll tee you up with this really quickly before we dive in. Sorry, Joe Rowles. There's 2 Joes now, so I have to clarify which one.
J squared.
Yeah, exactly.
J cubed, actually. But
yeah,
that's true. One of the things that we've talked about, the collective 3 of us, and I've talked about it a lot, even I think I mentioned it during the draft too, like one of the things that I try to do when approaching, whether it's team decision-making or draft process or whatever it is separating the process versus the results or the outcomes. And I know you've talked a lot about this as well, Joe, actually, and you as well, Joe M. And so give us a quick rundown on that, Joe, and then we'll dig in and kind of set us up to how we're thinking about looking at bowls.
The big thing that I kept trying to come back to when I was watching bowls this week was the idea of, as far as process goes, I wanted to see did his technique improve? Did his footwork improve? Did his anchor improve? Like the things that are actually predictive for next year. Because the thing is, the fact that he didn't allow a lot of pressures, there's no way just from looking at like a PFF grade to say, is that actually predictive for next year? Or is it just the happenstance of he played against weak opponents and he had Drew Lock kind of getting him out of it, and the scheme helped him? And I'm not necessarily saying all that was the case, but it's hard to say that just by looking at a grade without actually separating that from what you actually can see. And so that's what I was looking at when I was trying to see, because and so what I did when I did Gift Horse this week is I looked at Garett Bolles from the very beginning of the season. I looked at him from the middle of the season to see if he is improving. Does it go back to like the Browns game, or does it go to the Vikings game, or is it a matchup thing? Because those are two decent pass rush teams. And then I tried to look at games with Drew Lock, because those are the games that everyone says he improved in. So I tried to figure out, is it stable, and does it actually carry over into next year?
Yeah, and I think the repeatability piece is an interesting one, and it's a key piece of it because, like we said, process is repeatable, and it leads to outcomes. Outcomes aren't necessarily repeatable, and I think, two of the biggest examples I can think of, one on the positive and one on the negative, and I'll talk about this in an article I've got coming out soon as well, is you look at Von Miller. If you look at just outcomes for him, you could look at potentially pressures or sacks and say, oh, Von Miller had a down game, or where was Von Miller this game, or where was Von Miller this season, or something like that, if you're just looking at the outcomes. But if you dig into the tape, you can actually see Von Miller is still the same guy that he is. The outcomes could be attributed to a number of things, whether it's how quickly the team was getting the ball out, how much he was doubled. There's a lot of things that go into that. On the flip side, process, showing the process always catches up to you eventually, even if the outcomes don't look like it immediately. To me, is Trevor Siemian. Is early on in Trevor Siemian's career, the stats showed that he was doing pretty good. He hung 4 touchdowns on the Bengals, I think, early on in his career at one point. But those of us that were digging in and watching the tape consistently were calling out flags in his process of, look, he's not reading the defense. He's not, going through these basic things that a quarterback is expected to do. And eventually that caught up to him, and we saw him start to throw, balls to the other team, essentially. And
don't make me pull up my Trevor Siemian QB passer rating versus game plot, which was just a downward slope.
Yeah. And I think to me that's the prime example of that, is that the process kind of flagged early on that there were these issues, but the outcomes lacked that a little bit. But eventually outcomes will always catch up with process, and so I think that's where we tried to start, is at the very beginning of what you're talking about, Joe's technique and process, and did that improve, because that's where the repeatable outcomes will come into play.
So the first big question that I want to kind of try and approach is, what does Garett Bolles' technique look like over those last 5 games compared to, say, even when he was first coming into the league, or even before he came to the league? Because I think that's important to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's pull up.
And we have clips dating all the way back to back when he was in Utah, right?
Yeah. His final season in Utah.
So let's start with that.
Yeah, so the big things that you'll notice from Bolles, and I'll toss it to Joe here as kind of the resident expert as well, but just to set the stage, is the lack of just technique refinement in general with Bolles coming out was an issue. I know that was something that several O-line evaluators called out, and particularly his hands and the lack of taking true pass sets, and his performance in kind of true pass set situations. And so break down a little bit, Joe, what's going on here, and how that'll play into what we're going to see here in the future with Bolles as well.
Okay, so this was just a screen grab I took from the 2016 game between, at that time, the number 4 ranked Washington Huskies and I think the number 17 ranked Utah Utes. So if you look at Bolles here on the left, he's playing against Vita or Villa or whatever his name is. he ended up going in the either the late first or the early second. So, I mean, he's been in the league for a couple years. So pretty good, either, strong 3 technique or a nose, however you want to play him. But if you compare Bolles' technique here to the offensive tackle on the right for the Utes, Bolles has both of his hands outside the frame. So he's got his left hand, you can see it on outside of the elbow of Vea, and then his right hand is literally reaching around to the back of the shoulder pad. And see it on outside of the elbow of Vea, and then his right hand is literally reaching around to the back of the shoulder pad. And it's any time that you get your hands back there where they're visible to the refs, looking at the numbers of the guy that you're blocking, that usually draws a holding penalty. But it's a pretty big red flag that your hands are nowhere near where they're supposed to be, because you have, even if you're the strongest guy in the world, if you're trying to control a 320-pound defensive lineman who's got his hands in your chest and you're trying to fight him by doing that, you've lost. The only thing you've got at that point is basically your leg strength and your lower back. And you can see Bolles is really relying heavily on his lower back here because Vea has got his hands into Bolles' chest. Now compare that to the offensive tackle on the right. The offensive tackle on the right is almost turned as much as Bolles. So from a technique wise, he's not doing a great job of maintaining his angle. But you look at least from what I remember, he had his left hand where he was actually still up underneath the pad level of the outside linebacker who was rushing against him. And while he's got his right hand up a little high, it is still within the frame. So he's got a little bit better control. He's got a little bit more power here relative to what Bolles has got. Now, we have another clip that we're going to show in the look next, where Bolles is facing a much smaller guy. He's like a 230-pound outside linebacker, and I don't think this guy ever even sniffed the NFL. I remember looking up his bio on the Huskies roster. But in this particular play right here, Bolles actually does a pretty good job. He maintains his angle. He gets his hands inside the frame of the guy. He stays in front of him. He's keeping his base fairly wide, so he's protecting against the guy trying to come on the inside slant. But he's also, again, watch his feet here. Watch how he keeps his feet wide. And if we go back to that screenshot from the last play, you can see that both of his feet are right underneath him. He doesn't have a wide base. And yeah,
he doesn't have any power in his left leg.
Yeah, well, there's no power in his left leg, but he's also completely off balance. I mean, this is a play where if the quarterback didn't throw it, and I think the quarterback gets it out pretty soon after I took the screenshot, but Vea is setting him up, so Vea could literally just take his left arm and forklift him. Like Reggie White used to do. And literally, I mean, he's completely off balance, and Vea could just literally throw him past the quarterback and hit the quarterback.
And I've got a good, when you talk about hands inside the frame, I've got a clip here that I want to show. So Tyron Smith is, one of the best in the league. And I think his hands are some of the strongest that I've seen from, the left tackle position. And I just love his left hand here in contrast to what we're talking about with Bolles as well. And, and we can talk about some of the things that, that he does well. And I think, can help us set up what is it supposed to look like. And one of the big things too is the hip, and you mentioned it too, Joe, is the hip motion. He's staying square to the line of scrimmage. His hips aren't turned to a 90-degree angle, at the beginning of the snap. And then he's got that strong left hand to get inside the frame. I mean, that's a really strong left hand right there to push the defender by.
Yeah, well, and the other thing you'll notice with Tyron Smith, two things. I mean, his kick slide is almost by the textbook, right? So when you're doing a drop from the tackle position, at the snap, you kick your left leg back, and then you slide your right foot back. So you're trying to maintain as much contact with the ground as you can, because if your feet are in the ground, when the defender actually comes into contact with you, you've got the ground to help you. You're not trying to rely on just one leg to try and fight off a 300-pound man who's trying to rip your head off. So, that's why you're taught as an offensive tackle the kick slide. Because it is the most effective way to get depth but maintain your angle and your position. You'll also notice with Tyron Smith is he keeps his elbows in and his hands up so that whenever the defender gets there, Whether the defender comes inside, he can punch with his right. Defender comes outside, he can punch with his left. But he keeps his hands in a position to punch. One of the things I noticed a lot with Bolles is that he drops his hands. He comes out of his stance, and his hands are down there by his knees. And almost, number one, you've got a heck of a lot more distance to throw your hands at that point to try and make contact with the defender. But number two, when you do make contact, it's really easy if you're bringing your hands up from down that low to end up outside the frame of the defender. When you do make contact, it's really easy if you're bringing your hands up from down that low to end up outside the frame of the defender, so that you end up in the patented Bolles bear hug or chokehold.
And let's look at that. So we can start rolling through. Like that was very evident, especially early on in Bolles' career. And he we talk about kind of the patented arm chokehold coming around. And so we'll start with some clips from 2017 of just that really playing out.
I like to call this the Wrangler.
And fans will even notice this too, right? Like, I mean, anybody who's watched broadcast tape, anything, like, recognizes this piece of Bolles' game, right? So this was early on in his career, something that he definitely struggled with. But it's not, and most folks will attribute this to, oh, well, he just needs to stop holding. But it's really all the little things that he's doing that leads to the fact that he grabs that causes the defender to go by him. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, and one thing I want to kind of just bring up is the fact that this hold, there's many different ways to hold in the NFL, and there's many different ways to hold in football. So it's kind of a thing that with Bolles, this is the most consistent way that you see him hold.
Yeah.
Is the kind of the flyby, his outside arm will grab him around their neck. That's what he does. It's the Bolles.
Watch right there. See, notice his left foot. Yep. His feet are crossed. I mean, like my offensive line coach had been coaching for when I played. He'd been coaching in the college ranks for like 30 or 40 years. He would have slapped me if he saw me doing that because, that is – he called it getting duck-footed. You absolutely have no power. You're lost. The only thing you can do there to keep your quarterback from getting his head taken off is to either hold or to scream, look out, and hope he doesn't get his head taken off.
You mentioned the hands, too, at one point, Joe.
His hands are down there below his knees. His feet are crossing over, and he's turning so that you can see the front numbers on his jersey.
And I think and let's take a kind of pause right there. So what we're hoping to do, and again, this is like there's a lot of negativity in Broncos country around Garett Bolles, around the pick, around the holding calls, all of that, right? And so like our goal here is not to pile onto that, but it is to talk through and hopefully, help educate ourselves. I know I learned a lot when I was digging into this, but also help educate some of Broncos country as well as what is causing the things that we see on Sunday, like what's leading to that. And so, here when we talk this, we're establishing a baseline of here were the issues that he had coming into the league. So now let's compare that, so let's walk that through his career and see if any of those things improved. And so, that's the tone we want to take, and that's kind of what we're going through as we're working through this. This isn't meant to be just let's bash on everything the guy does wrong, but it's more of what are the learning opportunities here, and what are the things that are repeated and repeatable. It's not just the guy made a mistake. It's what are the repeatable things within the technique that are causing these problems.
And without knowing what these issues are, how can we really point out if he improved or not?
Yeah.
Well,
I've been focusing on Bolles, and I can just watching it in slow mo. You can see the point where he basically screws up because he stops moving his left foot. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know whether that's a function of him being so worried about getting beaten in the inside, getting beaten across his face. But this is against a really wide 9 who telegraphs that he's going outside from the start of the play. So the only thing I think of is maybe Bolles was worried about the guy that was lined up over Leary's outside shoulder. But the other thing I didn't get a chance to really look at was I think it was Schofield who was playing right tackle for us there, just to compare their technique. Because, again, Schofield was a guy like Wilkinson who technique-wise was always, sound. It's just he didn't have the athleticism to be able to do what he needed to do. So yeah, Schofield drops his hands too, and yeah, pretty much. All right, Schofield and Bolles, or whoever 73 is, I think that was Schofield. Both of them are pretty crappy on this play. That was a textbook on what not to do at offensive tackle, whether you're looking at the right or the left.
And again, so we'll roll through a couple of these 2017 ones quickly, but just more to establish. All right, you've got more of the same, really. That one, does draw the flag, and so that's what people mentioned, to your point, Joe, of like that's where we've seen the majority of the holding calls are these kind of things. When the defender, you turn your hips way too early, let the defender, get by you, your hands are too low, and so they're able to get by, and then at that point, that's kind of all you have to do, and so they're able to get by, and then at that point, that's kind of all you have to do is hold.
Yeah, well, and part of Bolles' problem is he's never had much of a punch. And so if you don't have much of a punch, you have to really make sure that you're there at the point where the defender's going to be. Otherwise, he's going to run up on you and just go around you. So, I think what he's trying to do is load up by bringing his hands from further down so that he can get more momentum when he throws his punch. But it hasn't been working. I mean, we're 3 years into Bolles playing in the NFL, and he still hasn't learned how to effectively use his punch, either with both hands or with one hand, at a time, to slow down the outside rushers and to make them run a bigger hump to push them past the quarterback. And partly in his defense, I mean, we had the incredible drifting quarterback. Trevor Siemian would end up 11, 12 yards behind the line of scrimmage just because he'd keep falling backward and backward and backward. So, even if Bolles took that tact of trying to push the guy deeper into the backfield, in a lot of cases, that was going to run him right into where Siemian was. So, he didn't have the best of quarterbacks to play for. He's finally got a quarterback to block for in Locke, who appears to have some pocket awareness. I was hopeful that Joe Flacco was going to show that, but Joe Flacco of 2019 was a shell of the man who, broke our hearts in 2012.
And I think so. When you talk about pushing guys past, I think this is a good example of Mitchell Schwartz, who is probably one of the best right tackles in the league and plays, really why Kansas City ended up signing him was because of how he shut down Von Miller when he played for Cleveland. And he's done pretty well against Von, throughout his time with the Chiefs too. But this is a good example of, Von is clearly, athletically superior to Mitchell Schwartz. And, even I think gets a pretty good jump on him and gets out in front of him. But in this instance, Mahomes does a good job stepping up, but then Schwartz is able to push him along.
Yeah, watch Schwartz's kick slide on this. Watch how quickly his feet get up and get back down into the ground. Even when he gets his feet close together, his feet are still in the ground when Von Miller gets there. So he has the power when he throws his punch to actually redirect Von and to push him a little bit wider.
There's another good one too, I think, of so
look how he recovered there.
Yeah, so gets beat initially on the dip, but then stays with it, and again gets some power in there to essentially just push him along the arc.
And one thing I want to mention with Schwartz especially is one of the things that makes him so good is that he's so boring. Like, he's not super flashy. You're not going to see him bury a guy or anything, but he just completely erases people because he stays with them.
Yeah. Yeah, he is the anti-Bolles in that way. He is so consistent. Bolles will have the occasional play where he drives a guy 6 yards off the ball on a running play because he takes a decent angle. Or where he actually looks perfect in terms of his pass pro. And then he'll follow it up with the next play where he looks like he doesn't have any clue what he's doing. And as somebody pointed out in the comment, we also have to remember, he has not been playing football for a long time. So, a guy like Tyron Smith, who was probably going to offensive tackle or offensive line clinics going back to the time he was in high school. And, there's no hitting in high school off-season work, but you can still do all kinds of technique work, and you can build that muscle memory that basically allows you to play offensive tackle at an NFL level. And Bolles doesn't have that, years and years of experience to fall back on.
And I think that's worth kind of stopping on for just a second, because for how much we're beating on Bolles, because and we're not trying to, but it's just it's going to happen just because like there are a lot of mistakes. It is worth noting the fact that Elway also took him in the first round. It's not Bolles' fault that he was taken to be the left tackle stalwart that he was. Like he was drafted by Elway.
Yeah.
So,
well, and we got to remember, Bolles was taken with the thought process that this man who has immense physical talent. I mean, he's got some of the quickest feet. If you look at his combine scores, his 3-cone and his 20-yard shuttle are some of the best you've seen for a man at his size. So, the thought process is, okay, he's got the physical attributes. We can build him into an offensive tackle.
Yep.
And that hasn't happened.
He actually reminds me of who came out this year, Austin Jackson. Austin Jackson that way. Austin Jackson has a lot of the same traits. Just really superior athlete, but just you can tell he's really raw to the position still. And just this is kind of like a lot of the mistakes we're seeing with Bolles is like what could happen with Austin Jackson if they don't kind of like take him along the right way.
Yeah, and I remember seeing some of these mistakes from a guy like Orlando Franklin. And you remember him, he came to the game pretty late too. He'd been playing soccer. I don't think he started playing football until he got to high school. And so that was one of the reasons why he didn't really fit or stick at tackle in the NFL, is he just didn't have the technique. You put him at guard where he can be much more of a mauler, and he actually had a pretty good career as a guard.
So one thing that I guess since you brought that up, we should probably – do you believe that Garett Bolles, if let's say they decide that Elijah Wilkinson's the left tackle, could Bolles feasibly play guard in the NFL, do you think? And I know we don't know. Like, it's hard to know because he's never done it. But I know people have asked me that for the last 2 years. So I guess it's just one of those things that's worth throwing out there. I don't think so. I don't think he has the power in his game. And I think the inside game would be too fast. But that's just my opinion based on like what I've seen. So like I definitely could be wrong.
I would say I agree with you. I don't think he has the power or the processing capability to handle playing the interior offensive line. You've got, if you look back at, and I remember this vividly from both 2017 and 2018, just over and over again, we were just getting beaten by defensive coordinators running stunts. And Bolles was just terrible. In fact, our whole offensive line in 2017 and 2018 were just terrible at handling stunts. I mean, that's all you had to do, and you were going to get a clean rusher on the quarterback, even only bringing 4. So, I did make some notes that he did improve, in my opinion, at handling stunts. And I'm going to chalk that up to Munchak this year, potentially Cooper. Again, I think if it took him really 3 years in the NFL to be able to handle a stunt and a switch, I don't know about trying to switch either to right tackle. If you're looking to the future of playing him somewhere other than left tackle, and that's a different ball of wax, or switching to guard. I don't know. And I don't want to pile on him because he's got ADHD. I think it would be a really steep mountain for him to climb to be able to shift from a position that he may finally be starting to get a feel for. Because I guess he started playing as a freshman or sophomore in high school, started playing football. So again, he's, a lot like Orlando Franklin in the fact that in terms of his muscle memory, he doesn't have a whole lot of time playing offensive line in the NFL, playing offensive line period. And so maybe he's starting to learn the game. The question is, can he ever get to the point where he's, anywhere close to the consistency of a guy like Mitchell Schwartz? I think trying to move him to a brand new position that requires faster processing and frankly more power is probably not a good move for him. I mean, remember, he's if you look at his build, he's listed at 305, but he does not have much mass in his lower body or in his core, really. He's pretty much a long, lean, quick offensive tackle who, even when we drafted him, I was like, okay, this guy's going to be one of those folks that has to rely on technique and being in the spot that he needs to be in. He's never going to be one of those guys that's, got the upper body strength to be able to just stonewall a 290-pound defensive end who's got, who's as quick as he is, just because he doesn't have that kind of upper body power.
And I think one of the things, like, to me, when you mention his athleticism, I think the upside there is, if he's able, because he has great recovery speed, and sometimes, he's able to mitigate some of the damage even from his initial set, just because of his recovery time and the way he, his foot speed. I think I've got a clip here from, let's see, I think this one might be a little bit. It's just even him, he recovers a little bit and then finally is able to get a little bit of a base. And again, I don't like don't like it in general at all, because you open your hips at the beginning, but the recovery ability is there. And that's one of the things you notice when you're watching the tape, is that he's always fighting and always trying. And so to me, it's never been a question of effort. It's more, and so when you have the athleticism that he does, you can kind of see the potential of, if he's able to chain some of this together, what he could potentially be. But I think it's just these continued issues keep cropping up. And what it reminds me of, like when you talk about recovery, I think I've got a clip from David Bakhtiari here, who's, again, one of the premier left tackles. That one, he does a great job getting out in front. This one here, I think he gets beat initially, and almost gets, his hands kind of in the Bolles area here, where he looks like he might be doing a bit like Bolles, but then he recovers and centers up and is able to plant his feet. And, to me, it's something like that Bolles could potentially, work towards.
Well, that clip of Bolles that you showed against the Chiefs, he actually does a pretty good job of resetting his feet and reestablishing his base. And this is also one of the few times where he ends up with both of his hands inside on the man's chest. So, ideally, he's driven quite far into the backfield. But once you get, you'll watch at the end here. Notice how he's got both of his hands underneath the jersey and the shoulder pads of that defender. Once you've got him like that, it doesn't matter how strong you are. You've got control of that defensive end or that outside linebacker. So that's an example of Bolles doing pretty much what you should do, even if he starts off with pretty poor technique. The fact that he can reestablish his base and get his hands inside and actually lock out to a certain extent, that's an example of Bolles having a pretty good play.
I think that's why NFL evaluators will always kind of fall for quick-footed tackles for the left tackle, because that ability to recover and reset like that is just so important for the position.
Yeah, because that's something that you're never going to see Wilkinson do that. His feet aren't quick enough. If he starts to get beaten like that and the defender gets into him, he can't reset his feet quick enough that usually he's either getting beaten around the edge, or, like on that play, he gets shoved so far back that the defender just has a beeline to the quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and this one's from 2018. I think this one's another one. I forget if it's a recovery, or I know it was a decent rep here in terms of, you got that inside. See, it's the inside hand again. When you're able to get it, he gets it a little bit more inside, it looks like this time.
And again, that's a good example. If the defender is trying to run the hump outside, you want to use, as a left tackle, you want to use your left hand. Okay, you want to try and extend that left hand and get it into his shoulder, get it into his chest, because once you do that, you either make him try and go through you if he can buckle your arm, or you make him run the hump. This is an example of Bolles actually effectively using a one-hand punch against a rusher. And what you'd like to see, ideally, is you'd like to see him get that right hand up underneath and get it inside the man's frame. But at least he does get the right hand on the outside of the shoulder pad and gets it up underneath a little bit, so that from the side judge's perspective, it doesn't look like he's holding. He's actually using some force from the front end, not from the side.
When you talk strong left hand, I just keep coming back to Tyron Smith. I love this one right here in terms of the initial punch, and then just that strong left hand getting in and just completely controlling the defender. It's that left hand you're talking about, Joe.
Yep. Yeah, notice how he not only that, but with Tyron Smith, is you actually watch him use both of his hands. So he makes that initial punch with his left, and you see him pull it back. So he's actually ready to deliver a secondary punch. So he pulls back his left because he's got his right arm on him now, and now he's got him set up. So if the defender tries to go inside, he's pushing with his right hand, defending against that. And if the defender keeps trying to go outside, he can bring that left hand back up, which you see him do, and he ends up locking the guy out with both hands. In fact, at the end of the play, you actually see him. He's up inside the frame. He's got the jersey, and you actually see him drag the defender down. We used to call that a faceplant block, where you get the guy, you've got him controlled so well that at the end of the play, you can literally just kind of pull down on him, and he goes flat on his face. You don't want to do it too often because there are some refs that will go, "Oh, that's holding," but
So we've kind of established the baseline. So let's jump into 2019 then. And so now that we know kind of what we're looking for and some of the issues that have cropped up with Bolles, I think maybe we wrap up the discussion with really that big question is, what did 2019 look like? And so I'll start here. Discussion with really that big question is, what did 2019 look like? And so I'll start here with this game against the Raiders because it was a bit more of the same. And you saw kind of that, the patented hook technique, the opening up the hips, all the low hands, it's all the stuff that we're talking about. So, obviously 2019 was a rough start for Bolles because, then you had the Bears game next, which was his 4 holding game. And really, to me, the 4 holds was just, it's egregious, but there was only one, there was probably 2 plays in that one that he probably should have been called and he wasn't, but the other one was this one here where he was called for his actual, what you typically see him called for holding. The rest of them were just kind of, to me, kind of just here and there. It was run blocking stuff or whatever. Obviously, it's, issues, but to me, this was the big one that you consistently saw, that we've talked about, his normal holding one, and this was the one that he was called for.
But, you watch his kick slide here, right? And he gets to a point, and I'm looking at this going, why are you turning? Yep. I'm like, okay, he's 2.5 steps into his kick slide, and he starts to turn. I'm like, you don't need to do that, dude. Maintain your angle, trust your left hand, and then you're in a position where if the defender tries to come inside you, you can still get him with your right. If the defender tries to go outside you, you shoot your left, you maintain your angle, you move your feet, and you make a decent block. But it's like he doesn't trust that his left hand or his left arm is capable of making enough of a punch that he immediately goes into this hip flip and starts to get to the point where you can see his front numbers or can't see his back numbers at all. So
because the initial kick is pretty good.
Yeah, he's keeping his feet low, keeping his feet in the ground. He's got his base, he's got his demeanor, as our O-line coach used to call it. But then he flips his hips, and it's like, God, what are you doing, dude? Don't do that.
Well, and keep that. Well, if you don't mind bringing that back up, I think one thing that's really important to note with that is look at how he looks compared to Wilkinson on the same play. Because I just finished watching Wilkinson's Bears game, and what really stands out is on these must-pass situations is where Bolles' biggest issues kind of crop up. Because on vertical pass sets is when he gets that hip. That it almost looks like a door hinge. He just turns so open that he kind of collapses the pocket before he needs to.
Yeah, and again, this will be, to your point, this is, I think, where you start getting a mix of the process and the outcomes, because of when you switch to a quarterback like Drew Lock that's a little bit more athletic, he can navigate a little bit more with the pocket being, collapsing like this, because you're essentially shortening the pocket when you do this.
Yep.
At this point, this is the pocket depth. As soon as Bolles turns his hips, that's the pocket depth. And so, you're allowing a straight line to a guy like Flacco who potentially doesn't have this escapability. And so, that's another reason where you see the effect of Bolles go down when Drew Lock comes in, but it's not necessarily Bolles improving. It's the fact that Drew Lock is making his job easier. over the last 5 games.
Like Joe was saying, this is a really good compare and contrast play, because if you focus on Bolles and then rewatch it and focus on Wilkinson, and Wilkinson maintains his positioning, maintains his demeanor, maintains his angle to the line of scrimmage, so that he can continue to go and get the outside rusher if the rusher goes outside. But you can see that the guy actually they end up having to switch off. He takes the linebacker coming, and the linebacker tries to take an inside line, and he's able to recover. Whereas Bolles would have at that point, probably already flipped his hips and been able to do nothing but hip check the guy.
Yeah, so here's another example, and this is another one. And this is where I think you start to see Wilkinson. His deficiencies come through. Is really his are all athletic in terms of just the ability. Once he misses that initial punch, he has no recovery. I mean, but Bolles, could probably recover in this one here. If you're looking at Wilkinson over here after this missed punch, there's just there's not a lot of margin for error with a guy like Wilkinson who doesn't have the recovery speed that even a guy like Bolles has.
Yeah. Well, you watch Wilkinson on here, he gets his hands slapped. So that's, the one thing that you want to have: quick hands, quick and strong hands, so that if you do get them knocked off, you can quickly recover. So you'll see a guy like a Tyron Smith, if somebody's trying to hand fight with him, try and knock it. If you do get them knocked off, you can quickly recover. So you'll see a guy like a Tyron Smith, if somebody's trying to hand fight with him, try and knock his hands off, he quickly resets them, brings them back around. Whereas Wilkinson, I guess, doesn't have the strength or the hand quickness, that his hands get knocked down, and then he's pretty much done. Whoever 97 is that Capsano or whatever his name is, or is that Clark? Whoever that is.
55 over here on Bolles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of those issues, because I just watched James before recording this. And I think this is one of those things where whether the Broncos decide on Wilkinson or Bolles for this coming season, if James is healthy and they're able to slide the protection towards that left tackle more, I'm not done watching Wilkinson yet, but there is reason to believe that if they can have one tackle at least who's reliable, they might be able to survive whoever ends up at left.
Yeah, again, like this, it comes back to what we talked, and is that a lot of the stuff that we're focusing on are these more kind of these true pass sets, the must-pass third down situations, because that's where Bolles' weaknesses really show up. If you look at the rest of the tape, and particularly with Drew Lock as the quarterback, when he's doing more of jump sets, or it's a moving pocket, or even some of the play action stuff, or when Lock's getting it out quick and being decisive with the ball, you're mitigating the effect of Bolles.
And I think it's worth noting, like, one of the things the Broncos did a lot better job of once they got away from Flacco was the quick game. Because one of the issues that kept cropping up when Flacco was quarterback is even if he has the right read right in front of him on the quick game, he doesn't always pull the trigger. He hesitates until somebody's wide open, whereas both Brandon Allen and Drew Lock weren't afraid to pull the trigger. And because of that, they ended up helping the offensive line a little bit. But at the end of the day, if you get into these must-pass situations, and you're going to do this in the NFL, an offensive lineman who has trouble on these kind of sets, it's going to crop up again.
And again, this is a great example. I think this play kind of almost encapsulates the Drew Lock experience for what he does for Garett Bolles. Because you look at Bolles, and here we'll go full screen and kind of break this down. Like when you look at Garett Bolles, it's the same issues that are cropping up. He's immediately flipping his hips, so you've shortened the pocket, the hands are down, and so he's immediately beat. But a guy like Drew Lock escapes. And this turned into I don't think he threw it away. I think it turned into a, probably 5-6 yard gain or more. I forget if Lock gained a first down here. But you had a guy with a little bit of athleticism into that, and, the effect of Bolles isn't there, And so when people cite the sack numbers or, there's not the holding numbers, well, that's not necessarily a reflection of Garett Bolles' technique improving. The technique is the exact same. Like, this is the exact same technique that we've seen in 2017, and we saw it in 2016 when he first came, when he was at Utah, and we've seen it throughout 2018 and early 2019, right? Exact same technique that we've been talking about. The only difference is you've got the Drew Lock effect in terms of the athleticism.
Yeah, that's a play that if Flacco's quarterback there, that's a sack. Brandon Allen maybe takes off fast enough to be able to outrun the two defenders that both whip our O-line. Yeah, I mean, that's a play where the only reason it wasn't a sack is that Drew Lock recognized pressure coming from the weak side pretty quickly, since it was a shotgun set, and took off with it, knowing that there wasn't going to be anything open immediately, because I'm guessing we didn't have a hot read.
Yep. And I want to mention that there is a play in the Browns game where Brandon Allen does essentially the same thing. It looks almost like a QB run, because he just starts running for his life. So, and that's why I don't think it's necessarily Drew Lock helped Bolles. And I do think Drew Lock helped Bolles, but I don't think it's just that Drew Lock has this special mobility. I think just having a quarterback who can get away from Bolles collapsing helped, because I think Allen helped that way too.
Yeah. And again, and I'll reiterate what I've said before, is like, that's not like having an athletic quarterback is a bonus. It's not a strategy, or at least it's not a winning strategy for sure. Like, you look at what the Texans with Deshaun Watson, like having Deshaun Watson run around for his life and heave something up and it actually worked. Like, that's not a long-term strategy. And we're seeing that play out, for the Texans as they drastically try to get, Watson some help. And so for those that are citing Drew Lock or even Brandon Allen when he was there as, this means we're fine offensively, it's mitigating it, yes, but it's not a strategy to have an athletic quarterback that can just run away when your left tackle falls apart a little bit.
Yeah.
And so we'll get into, since we started into your left tackle falls apart a little bit.
Yeah.
And so we'll get into, since we started into the Drew Lock piece, I think this is a good time to kind of talk through that. The biggest, I think, thing that we've heard from folks is, one, because of the PFF grade I think the PFF grade was over the last 4 games or something. They said, Bolles was one of their highest graded left tackles over the last 4 weeks of the season. And then the low penalty numbers and the low sack numbers is the fact that Bolles became better when Drew Lock came in. So we've got clips, digging into the tape of this, this Texans game obviously is with Drew Lock. This is the Chargers game here. And again, you're seeing the exact same stuff on the outside. You're seeing the hip flip immediately. And then this one doesn't get called. And so for the folks that might say, the penalties decreased, well, the referees changed their definition or just, decided to swallow their whistle on this one, because this is the exact same stuff that we were seeing in week 1 and in week 2, and it drew a holding flag. And so it's just another example of why you can't, and it's a great play. It's a completion, it's a first down, and so you can't it's just another example of you can't just look at the outcome of the play and say, well, he did a good enough job, Lock got the ball out, it wasn't called holding, so we'll call it good. This is the exact same technique that got them tons of holding calls all throughout Bolles' career.
Yeah, and that's when I was looking up the what PFF defines as a pressure. They say, I think they worded it something along the lines of the defender altering the quarterback's throwing motion, because of proximity. And that was a prime example of not just proximity, but Max Crosby there actually hits Drew Lock through Garett Bolles while he's releasing the ball. Yep. So it's only Drew Lock's arm strength that allows that to become a completion. A weaker arm quarterback like Brandon Allen or the 2019 Flacco, that's either a sack or it's getting thrown into the ground because the quarterback's getting hit while he's throwing it.
And I think this is another one. This is a good example of what you guys talked about with the defenses that Denver faced later on too, is against a rusher that has a little bit more of a rush plan. This is exactly what we saw, with Whitney Merciless with the Texans, or when Frank Clark was going against Bolles with this type of techniques, because it's the exact same thing. Hands are outside. The defender immediately gets into Bolles' chest. He just doesn't have a plan after that. He doesn't execute any rush move to get past him. And so if this is a guy that has any type of, bend around the edge or wants to continue around that arc, he's probably hitting Lock before Lock gets this ball out. But it'll go down as essentially a win for Bolles because he kept the defender at bay. But really, it's the pass rush just isn't strong enough, and Bolles gets by. He kind of gets lucky a little bit because it's the exact same technique. Hands are outside, the hips are flipped. It's not a good rep from a technique standpoint, but it pans out and Lock's able to get the ball out.
Well, towards the end, this one isn't terrible, because towards the end he actually resets his base. And you can watch him bring that left hand back around and reset it in the defender's chest. That's something that he wasn't doing really in 2017. I wasn't watching for it in 2018, so I'm not certain if he did that a lot in 2018. But I don't remember him doing much of that earlier in the year. So that, those people saying that he did improve, that may be an example of his improvement, where he's got the defender into his chest, but instead of just going all bear hug on him, he actually does try to disengage with his left and reset his left in the defender's chest, and it ends up becoming a decent block because of that. Because his feet are quick enough that he can reset them. He's able to get his hand back in position and try and at least get some force back on the defender and not get just completely run back into his quarterback.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things too is if you had a guy like a Frank Clark or something who's probably at this point they're disengaging and running the yard.
Yeah.
And I think that's where
you had it paused right there just a second ago. That's a good example of, again, this is where Bolles is failing, right? Look at how far his head is above the rest of his body. His head and shoulders, Bolles is failing, right? Look at how far his head is above the rest of his body. His head and shoulders you want your head and shoulders to, as much as you can, be over your hips and your knees. Right, that's when you have your power as an offensive lineman. Bolles is so far out in front of his skis right now that if he had a defender that knew what he was doing, that defender literally just has to pull Bolles, down into the outside, and Bolles goes flat on his face, and the defender literally runs over him to the quarterback. That's a situation where Bolles gets lucky because the defender doesn't take advantage of Bolles screwing up. But it's kind of he does some good things, but his process was pretty poor to get there.
Well, in this one, because again, I went back to the Vikings game and the Browns games because I wanted to see how much the improvements I saw kind of carried through. And against the Browns, Olivier Vernon because that was Brian Austin, who's a 4th-round pick for the Lions last year, and maybe he becomes like a premier edge rusher down the road. But I do think you guys are both right in that he just doesn't really have the hand moves yet. Whereas you look at like an Olivier Vernon and watch what he does with Bolles' hands. Like he just schools him. And he did that consistently. Like I watched the Browns game and I made it through the first half before I had to turn it off because I just felt sick. And like I ended up going back to it to finish it, but it was just like these kind of plays were all over that game.
Yeah, and this is a jump set here. And it's actually not a bad jump set. It's just more of this, to your point, illustrates the superior hand technique here by the Browns rushers.
Yeah. Well, and again, you see Bolles drop his hands at the snap, right? Ideally, even on a jump set, you want your hands to be almost the first thing that makes contact with the defender. You jump out, boom. You throw your hands almost like a run play, and then you go from there. Whereas Bolles, he jumps out, but he keeps his hands down there. And as soon as he tries to bring him up, Werner's quick enough to just slap him away. Okay, I'm around you. Yeah. And
that's one of my consistent issues I thought I saw is on jump sets and 45-degree sets. When he gets his hands up, he does okay, but you can't count on him to get his hands up. And against the edge rushers who actually know what the heck they're doing, that's a death sentence.
Yeah, so I was going to say right there, his hands are in decent position. He's got them in tight. Looks like he's ready to throw a punch from that last play, but yeah. So we can go on to the next one.
Again, we can begin to put a bow on this a little bit because I think it kind of shows the point a little bit that we've been talking about is from a technique standpoint, those holes are still there. And so I think it kind of sets up the question is what do you do moving forward and how do you mitigate it? And is this something that Mike Munchak can help with for this next season?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Munchak work miracles. I mean, he turned Alejandro Villanueva from a wide receiver at Army to a Pro Bowl left tackle. So, he can turn, clay into gold in some cases. I don't know that it's going to happen with Bolles just because he's had, what was it, 2 years ago or last season, 2018 season, he literally had a coach that was just his coach. There was somebody on the staff that's all his job was to try and turn Bolles into a decent starting left tackle for the Broncos. And, if the Broncos are that worried about you that they've got a guy on the staff, that's all his job is, to make sure that you're trying to learn how to play left tackle, and you still don't get it, and then they go out and hire, a guy who had been in contention for the head coaching job to come in and be the offensive line coach, and you still don't show much in the way of improvement year over year.
And I think it's one of those things that if Munchak and the Broncos believed that they could reach Bolles, they would have picked up the fifth-year option, because if Bolles suddenly turns on the light this year, he's going to cost more than the fifth-year option.
Oh yeah,
and they would have hedged their bets on the fact that Munchak could do it. And I'm in the way Denver drafts and the way Elway operates, Munchak had a very loud voice in the room. Should we pick up that option or not? The fact that they didn't, to me, is kind of a sign. That, and the fact that they are talking about having Wilkinson compete with him. Before the draft, I didn't think that was anything. I thought that was just a way to try and motivate him. But watching you, and again, I have to go back and start seeing like Wilkinson's first games compared to like now. But like you look at Wilkinson's technique, we already mentioned it, but his biggest issues are athletic. But like from a technique standpoint, he does the things you want a tackle to do. There's a very real possibility that the Broncos just say, we'll take the guy who can't beat out or can't beat speed, but we can at least rely on him to be in the right place and do the right things, because they can survive that movie.
Because then at least you have a consistent process where you can scheme for
do the right things, because they can survive that movie.
Because then at least you have a consistent process where you can scheme for or plan for known deficiencies.
Yeah.
If it's going to be a consistent deficiency across the board, and I think that's a good point to bring up with Mike Munchak, is his prowess with undrafted guys and seventh round picks. So I went back and watched a little bit of Kelvin Beachum. He was a seventh round pick, and he was I think he's still out there on the market actually, but he played really well for the Steelers. I put a tweet out the other day that Mike Munchak had guys. It was like 4 different guys over his time with the Steelers who contributed at least a good chunk of starting snaps throughout the season. You had, you already mentioned it, Joe, Villanueva. You had Kelvin Beachum, who was a 7th round pick. And then you had 2 other guys, Chris Hubbard, who got signed by the Browns. And he hasn't been really good since he left the Steelers, but he put in some decent snaps to get a good contract with the Browns. And then Filer, I think his name is, he played about 70% of the snaps with the Steelers when their other guy, Marcus Gilbert, went down. He filled in for him at right tackle. And so Mike Munchak has turned, all of those undrafted / 7th round pick guys into a guy that it can at least, contribute some solid starting snaps.
Yeah. And if you go back to January, I actually did a whole article on this where I was looking at, how often Mike Munchak has turned low round or undrafted, day 3 kind of guys into starting offensive linemen. And it's pretty consistently throughout his career. He's pretty much dealt with the dregs and turned them into functional players. Now, that being said, Garett Bolles was a 1st-round draft pick. He was the first tackle off the board. So it's not like he's dealing with dregs. But on the flip side, if you look at Elijah Wilkinson was an undrafted free agent. If you look at a guy like Jake Rodgers, who's on his 9th NFL franchise right now and has bounced around the league forever and is literally the same age as Garett Bolles, maybe a guy like Rodgers, maybe a guy like Calvin Anderson, who we picked up off of I think it's the Cowboys practice squad. There are some other tackles in the building. So maybe there's a dark horse out there that's going to turn into our next, hopefully our Jason Peters, right? Jason Peters is the guy that everybody likes to bring up because he was an undrafted free agent and he turned into an all-pro left tackle. But for every Jason Peters, there are 175, guys like Andreas Knapp or Napa or whatever that guy's name was, that 6'9", Danish guy that we had on the practice squad for a while that we were trying to turn into an offensive tackle that never turned into anything.
And I will mention Jake. You mentioned Jake Rodgers. He played under Mike Munchak, and I know that's something we've talked about as well. But there's obviously some synergy there, and the reason why Denver brought him in. And so, at least from my thoughts for 2020. I think you mitigate the weaknesses that Bowles brings, because I don't know that we're going to see them significantly improve. We didn't over the last 3 years. And so I think you try to mitigate those as much as possible. And then in camp, if they're in a camp and you're able to work with them, with Mike Munchak, if you're trying to groom a guy that can maybe even come in midway through the season and take over as the starting left tackle, if you're counting on Mike Munchak to develop a guy.
Yeah. I was looking because I've got a post that's going to drop tomorrow, I think, where I was looking at the year-over-year change. So Pro Football Reference has advanced passing stats now, and one of the things they have is a team-by-team pressure percentage allowed. And so they only goes back to 2018. But one of the things I was really curious to see is that, hey, year-over-year, did the Broncos' offensive line get better? And I think I wrote a whole piece on this at the end of the 2019 season. But I went and looked at the whole league, and one of the things that really jumped out to me is the fact that in 2018, at least according to Pro Football Reference, the Chiefs were one of the worst teams in the league at allowing pressure on their quarterback. Something like 35% of their dropbacks resulted in pressure. It was it was one of the worst in the league. They moved up to, I don't want to say it was like the middle of the pack. It was 12th or something in 2019. But that was a huge jump, that 14% drop in pressure percentage allowed. And when you have that combined with, the playmakers they've got and the play caller and the quarterback they've got, it's a deadly combination. So one of the things that I was literally trying to do while you guys were talking was pull up the Chiefs roster and see if there was that much of a difference in the offensive line that they had, or whether it was essentially the same group of 5 guys. Because I know Mitchell Schwartz was their right tackle. I know Fisher was their left tackle. They had the MD guy with the hyphenated name who was, I think, starting at guard. I know Fisher was their left tackle. They had the MD guy with the hyphenated name who was, I think, starting at guard in 2018. I'm not sure if he was back in 2019. But, if they did have essentially the same offensive line, the same coaching staff, and all it was, hey, the players just got better year over year, then, or maybe it was, the quarterback changed. Maybe Mahomes changed the way he was playing just enough such that he didn't allow, that 1 in 8 plays to turn into a pressure anymore. He got the ball out quicker, or he was faster at picking up on when the pressure was coming and when to take off or when to throw it out of bounds. But it is an interesting thing. And you look at the Broncos, right? I mean, we got the Broncos stats, and they're in there, and it was a slight improvement year over year. I think it was like a 2% improvement in pressure percentage allowed. Now, admittedly, you're going from Case Keenum, who I guess had a feel for the pocket, to Joe Flacco, who didn't really have a feel for the pocket anymore, to Brandon Allen, who I don't know if he knew what the pocket was, to Locke, who not only had a good feel for the pocket, but seemed to also have a really good sense for when to get the heck out of Dodge, probably because he spent 4 years at Missouri running out of Dodge a lot.
And this is something I'm going to try and get into a little bit more now that we have, now that we're through the draft, is I want to kind of see what Pat Shurmur did as far as this, because before the season started, I remember going back and reading Football Outsiders does an almanac every year, and they looked at the Kyle Shanahan offense, and Kyle Shanahan's offense does tend to put quarterbacks under quite a bit of pressure, just because they do rollouts, they do a lot more boot action game, stuff like that. So they rely on the quarterback to get themselves out of, dating back to the Matt Ryan era. When Kyle Shanahan was with Matt Ryan took a lot of hits. So I'm curious if with Pat Shurmur, if that alone could be a big difference, because I only have watched one game since the draft, but if Pat Shurmur does use more quick passing game, that could help Bolles. That doesn't necessarily mean Bolles is suddenly the answer, but it could be a way to kind of alleviate the issues you're going to have at left tackle.
Yeah. So
I'm looking at the numbers here in front of me from the article that's dropping tomorrow, and the Giants 2018 gave up pressure on 26% of their 26.4% of their dropbacks. It was essentially unchanged in 2019, 25.8. So
with two different quarterbacks,
particularly, and with Daniel Jones being a heck of a lot more mobile than late in his career Eli. They were still getting a lot of pressure, but you got to figure that those pressures will result into different things. You have the case where Eli was probably taking the pressure because he was waiting for a play to develop and giving it another couple of milliseconds before he released the ball. and Daniel Jones, maybe it was, he just didn't recognize where the pressure was coming from, or, didn't know when to take off and scramble. But yeah. And again, I have no idea if there was a significant difference in the offensive line for Giants in 2018.
I know they signed Solder, I think in 2019. I believe I might be wrong.
But he was terrible.
Yeah, he
I remember when I did my review of offensive tackles across the league, and Solder was just like, he was from a sacks and holding perspective, he was worse than Bolles. He was up there.
I remember making the move. I just don't remember what year, and I'm looking right now. But yeah, and it's just one of those things. I want to go back and kind of look at the scheme to see if there's ways that Shermer might be able to help Bolles, because that is one significant, and that was 2018. But that is one significant difference that Denver has, even if the offensive line stays exactly the same, other than Glasgow, other than the interior coming in. But if Shermer does things to kind of mitigate the damage at left tackle, or if James coming in, they're able to slide the protection, there might be ways to kind of make the left tackle less of an issue. So
let's put a bow on this and do a wrap up. And you guys give me, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, just let's call it hopeful. How hopeful are you of Denver's, and let's not just say left tackle in general, but just the offensive line performance? If you looked at what your stats, Joe, about Denver being able to maybe turn it around or help their pressure percentage from last year and increase the offensive line, with 5 being kind of middle of the road, stays the same, 0 being it gets, terribly worse, or I'm not hopeful at all, to 10 being I'm super hopeful. Just give me a number.
I'm going to go with 6. And that's because, in doing the research for the pieces dropping tomorrow, there were some teams like the Texans that had, because, in doing the research for the pieces dropping tomorrow, there were some teams like the Texans that had, and the Chiefs, but the Texans were another team that had a dramatic drop in their year-over-year pressure. And they did it with, not necessarily high draft picks. They did it with just development of their internal players. I think they picked up the guy that's starting at left tackle for them in the 4th round. And I want to say they still had Chris Clark maybe starting at right tackle for him. So, we're not talking about extremely talented offensive linemen. We're talking about guys that, were day 3 or undrafted kind of players and have had to make themselves into decent offensive linemen. So I'm hopeful that they can, that another year of development under Munchak, maybe. And again, I'm not very hopeful that it ever clicks for Bolles. I think he is what he is. He's going to be the inconsistent left tackle. But maybe, having James, having Cushenberry, having Risner, having Glasgow, that we've got enough of a core of offensive linemen who know what they're doing, that we can mitigate. And again, a lot of that depends on James being healthy for full season. And of course, by the calendar, this should be his healthy year, because he had, unhealthy, healthy, unhealthy, healthy. So we're on the healthy year now. But, if you look at the other guys, hopefully we won't see the rookie wall again from Risner, that he'll continue playing well into the 4th quarter of the season. Again, we may see that with Cushenberry. I don't know. I mean, if you look at LSU, they played a whole bunch of passing snaps in a whole bunch of games last year. So from the perspective of a standard rookie, he's not really your standard rookie. He did play a lot of football last season. So I'm not as worried about him running into the rookie wall as I was with Risner. But then you've got Glasgow and you've got James. You've got 2 veterans on the right side. So, again, knock on wood that everybody stays healthy. But I'm thinking that, our offensive line can go from being bottom 3rd to middle of the pack, maybe even, the edge of the top of the pack, somewhere in the 10 range. And again, if you go back to the years of Peyton Manning, the quarterback can really help the offensive line. So you've got a guy like Joe Flacco who didn't. You got a guy like Brandon Allen that was kind of a mixed bag. There was some place where he really helped the offensive line, some place where he didn't. I think that in Drew Lock's second year, in starts 6 through 16 or 21 or whatever next season, he's going to develop to the point where he's a true asset. He's actually making his offensive line better. I don't know that we're going to see the same level of development that we saw out of the Chiefs, where they went from Mahomes in his first full year as a starter, basically, getting hit, pressured all the time, to 2019 Mahomes, being in the top third of the league as far as not getting pressured with ostensibly the same offensive line. And part of that is in theory, we don't have ostensibly the same offensive line. We've got Glasgow coming in. We've got Cushenberry coming in. We've got James, who's essentially new to the Broncos because he played 71 snaps last season. We've got a group of guys that don't necessarily have that familiarity, but I am optimistic that the sum of the parts is going to be better than what it was in 2019.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think 6 is probably where I would be at too, and for a lot of reasons that you mentioned too. I like the new additions on the offensive line, and we'll see what happens giving Munchak another year. What about you, Joe?
I think if they stay healthy, I'm even more confident than that. I'm just if there's an issue at tackle, like for one, I'm not ruling out Wilkinson being the left tackle anymore after watching his Bears game, just because I do think there's issues that would crop up. But I think if they can mitigate with that with the rest of the additions to the offensive line, they may very well just choose that that's worth surviving because they can at least know what they're trying to survive. But all the issues Joe mentioned, I think the fact that Munchak was the reason they brought in Cushenberry, the reason that Munchak, like all the guys that Denver has brought in on the offensive line other than Bolles and or Wilkinson are Munchak guys. That gives me a lot of confidence that so long as they can stay healthy, this offensive line, plus the fact that we have Locke, it should be a better offensive line than we've seen, so long as they stay healthy. So,
well, we'll see what happens. And again, Joe, thanks for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
I enjoyed
it. Try it again sometime, breaking down some film. Hope everybody enjoyed, was able to kind of see what we were talking about a little bit. Maybe we'll try this again. But thanks again for hanging with us and following along. I think we've heard your feedback. We put a thing out on Twitter. I know Joe was talking about it the other day. I heard that folks want to focus more on some defense over the next couple weeks, and so we will be doing that, and that'll be coming to Cover 2 Broncos pretty soon. So hang with us, and we'll dig in some defense over the next couple weeks.
Let's go Broncos.
Go Broncos. Stay safe, guys.
All right.
Go. Stay safe, guys.